Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the life and times of Jesus in our continuing survey of ancient history as a framework for the Bible. Back in the 500s, if you would ask somebody what year it was before Pope John I, 525 AD, and what he's going to do, he's going to commission a new system to be enforced. If you had asked somebody what year it was, they might have used the year dating back to the founding of the city of Rome. That is, they might have said, well, this year is 800 years after the founding of the city of Rome, which I guess is okay as long as everybody knows when that city was founded. Another means that was used was the reign of Diocletian. So if you asked what year it was, you had to specify in your answer, are you talking about the founding of the city of Rome, AUC, or are you talking about the reign of Diocletian, or some other means? And Pope John I commissioned a monk, Dionysius, that he might arrange a new calendar and use a new event to begin dating that calendar, and that event would be the birth of Christ. So accordingly, he thought that Christ had been born at the year that they thought of as the 753rd year, or 754th year after the founding of the city of Rome. So that became the year 1 AD. Anno Domino, the year of our Lord. And anything before that became, going backwards, 1, 2, 3, 4 BC, before Christ. And anything after that became 1, 2, notice there's no year 0. Now, unfortunately, Dionysius did a pretty good job, but he missed it by a couple of years. Because now we know that Herod the Great, who was still alive, according to the book of Matthew and Luke, who was still alive when Jesus was born, he died in 4 BC. So, we have, we missed it, and we're just going to continue with our same old calendar we've been using a long time. Too late to change it now. So the death of Herod takes place 4 BC. Now, his reign had begun technically in 40 BC. He had been declared the king of the Jews by Rome. It wasn't until 37 AD that he actually got back to Israel and now regained Palestine, drove out the Parthians and subjugated any of those in revolt, and then dies in 4 BC. One of the things that helps us to specify this is where Josephus mentions a lunar eclipse that was prior to Herod's death, and sure enough we can look at around the spring of 4 BC and we can see a lunar eclipse that is only a partial lunar eclipse, but still a lunar eclipse that took place around that time. So when we look at the events that are recorded in the Bible around the birth of Christ, of course we have his birth, that's when he's born in Bethlehem. And then Luke chapter 2 verse 21 talks about how 8 days later he was circumcised. That was the custom among the Jews. A child would be circumcised when they were 8 days old. And then Mary and Joseph take Jesus to the temple for a presentation in the temple. And that would take place, you would wait 40 days, so on the 41st day after his birth, that's when they would have done that. Now, we're not told specifically it was 40 days, but that's the custom. That's probably around the case. And it's sometime after that the Magi come, and they come first to Herod, and then they come to Bethlehem, and they worship the baby Jesus. He's not a brand new infant anymore, but still fairly young. And it will be immediately after that Joseph and Mary, they don't go to Jerusalem after this. They go from there down to Egypt to escape the murderous plot of Herod the Great. So that's our time frame regarding the birth of Christ. Now, we are told in Luke's account that there's a census that was ordered by by Augustus, the emperor of the Roman Empire. We know him as Gaius Octavius Augustus. He had actually quite a few other names too, but we'll suffice it with just those. He is the one who said on his deathbed that I found Rome brick and left her marble. It's a wonderful time, I guess, if you were a Roman, when things were relatively peaceful, and Octavius believed that the people who ought to pay taxes shouldn't be Romans, but it should be all the peoples that were conquered by the Romans, and so accordingly he ordered a series of censuses to be taken. This is the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome, and it's at such a time that he orders a census, and we're told that it causes Mary and Joseph to leave Nazareth and come down to Bethlehem, where Jesus is going to be born there. Now, there's some problems in dating the census. You see, Quirinius, we're told, was governor of Syria at the time the census was taken. Luke actually says this is the first census taken when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Well, he was governor, held that post, we know, from 6 to 7 AD. Well, that's much too late to impact the birth of Jesus, which was before the death of Herod the Great, which is 4 BC. Furthermore, we have no records of an earlier census having taken place. And there's no known census while Quirinius was governor. We have some later censuses about which we know, but not about anything earlier or while he was governor of Syria. Now, there's some proposed solutions, and I'm going to mention the first couple, but I don't think they're accurate. So let me just sort of get them off the plate. It's been suggested that the passage in Luke chapter 2 can be translated to read that this census was taken before Quirinius was governor of Syria. I don't think that's a good translation. I think that you're pressing the language. It doesn't say that naturally, I don't believe. Secondly, another proposed translation reads that this census was before that, which was while Quirinius was governor of Syria. In other words, there was a census in his day, and this was before that. I see what they're trying to do. I don't think we have to go with that translation. I don't think we have to change the translation that's found in most of our in most of our English translations. What we should note is that the term that Luke uses when he speaks about Quirinius being governor is a general term, and he uses it, both the term governor and king, in not always a specific sense, but sometimes in a general sense. Like when he speaks of Herod Antipas as being a king. Well, technically he wasn't a king. He was, I guess he looked like a king, talked like a king, but walks like a duck, quacks like a duck. Sometimes you call it a duck, even if it's not. And Luke did that too. He says that this was the first census while Quirinius was the governor, or we could say it this way, while Quirinius was governing Syria. And that expands our window just a bit. You see, we've discovered a gravestone, a tombstone, called the Lapis Tiburtinus, and it records the achievements of an unknown governor. He's not named, but this governor served as the praetor of Syria, and he served it twice, according to the inscription. And we don't have any records of any governor of Syria having served twice, which means that our records are incomplete. You see, we also know that Quirinius commanded legions in Syria after 12 BC. So he's in the right place, doing governing work, even if he didn't have the actual title, or maybe he did and we just don't know about it. And so Luke's account really does fit the facts as we know them. Now, remember, we have Jesus born and he's laid in a manger. And every movie or picture that I've ever seen of this always has these little wooden mangers. That's not very accurate, because when I've been in Israel, every manger in Israel I've ever seen was always made of, not of wood, because wood was far too valuable, but of stone. And so maybe we can imagine sort of a stone manger and a baby wrapped, and that's what you would do with babies, you'd wrap them. But the shepherds were told this was a sign. So he's wrapped and he's laid in or on a stone holder. Imagine this little wrapped figure lying on a stone slab. Almost looks perhaps like a body that's been wrapped and left. And maybe that's why it was described as a sign. It's picturing what Jesus came to do. Here's a baby who came to die, and to die for us. Now let's go to Bethlehem. This is a modern picture of Bethlehem. Notice it's built on a high hill. The city's grown quite a bit since that first century. If you go to the place that is traditionally called the tomb of the Nativity, notice the large gate that's walled up, and then you have the small opening. This was done in the Crusader times. Now the church here was much older than that, but in Crusader times, the Crusader knights they would ride with their horse right into church, and the priests and monks wanted to stop that, so they walled that up and made it a much lower entrance now, where to go into that church, to go into the presence where Jesus was supposedly born, one has to bow down. I think there's something special about that. And of course, you go in, it doesn't look anything like a stable. We're never told in the Bible that it was a stable. He was laid in a manger, in a feeding trough for animals. But remember, in that day, among the poorer people, you would have sort of what we think of as a split-level home. And in the lowest level, people would keep their animals. And you might have a feeding trough there. And then if you went up to the a little bit higher level, that was the living quarters. So, we don't necessarily have a hotel Sects or that sort of thing. Now, Luke says because he was laid in a manger because there was no room in the inn. But don't think in terms of a Holiday Inn or something like that. The word that's translated in Luke chapter 2 is the same word that Luke uses later on to talk about the upper room, the place where Jesus met with his disciples to eat their Last Supper. Not necessarily a hotel, might have been somebody's just additional chamber, their guest room. And there was no room in the guest room because there were all sorts of guests from out of town, and so the baby Jesus was taken and laid in a manger. Now, in Matthew chapter 2, we have the description of the Magi who come. And the Magi were an ancient order of priests who come from the east. That is, they come from Parthia. This is the land to the east, what had formerly been part of the Persian Empire. And the Magi were monotheists. That is, they believed in one God. We know this, in contrast to the Romans and the Greeks that were polytheists in the day. And one of their duties was to appoint the king of Parthia. Now, they wouldn't decide who he was, but when a king was being crowned, it was the Magi who would take the crown and place it upon his head. So here are these Magi, these ancient order of priests coming from Parthia to say, we've heard about one who is born king of the Jews. Now, of course, that's not Herod the Great. That's Jesus. And they come to see this one. The Parthians had fought against Herod back in 40 BC, and it had been at great pains that he had retaken the kingdom and had pushed the Parthians out. And so when these Magi show up looking for one who's been born king, well, you can just see where there's all sorts of trouble that comes about as a result. Now, by the time we get to the life of Jesus, once he's been born and Herod the Great dies, and then Archelaus reigns for a time until 6 AD, and at 6 AD, Archelaus, the son of Herod, he's removed. And following this, we have a series of procurators. Sometimes they have the title of prefect instead, but I'm not going to get fussy over the name. They're serving as governors over the land of Israel. And we actually have the names of all of these. Coponius, he's governor of Israel when there's that revolt led by a man named Judas of Galilee, who's mentioned in Acts chapter 5, verse 37. I'm going to pass over Marcus Ambibius and Ananias Rufus. But then there's Varius Gratus, who in his reign, and this is leading just up to close to the beginning of the ministry of John the Baptist, he deposes Annas from the high priesthood. You see, a high priest would normally be ruling as priest, be officiating as high priest for his whole life. It was until he was too old and too infirmed. But the Romans didn't like one person holding all that authority. And so the high priest is forced to step down, and a son of his will be put in his place, and then another son, and when he runs out of sons, then it's going to be his son-in-law. That will be Caiaphas. That's how we get Caiaphas in the New Testament. Well, I go from Gratus to Pontius Pilate. And Pilate will be the one who is the governor of Israel. And when I say Israel, remember that's really Samaria and Judea, but not so much Galilee, because Galilee has a different ruler. It has a tetrarch, a ruler of a fourth part, and that's going to be another son of Herod the Great, Herod Antipas. So Pontius Pilate, he's the governor. He's got the higher authority, and it will be while he is governor that Jesus is crucified. Going on from there, we have Marcellus, who becomes the governor after Pilate, and Marcellus will depose Caiaphas, and they're going to go from there to a different high priest. And then, after he is removed, we will have the grandson of Herod the Great, Herod Agrippa, and there's going to be another Agrippa, so we'll refer to him as Herod Agrippa I. He rules as king of a united Judea and Samaria from 41 to 44 AD. Now, following him, again, we're going to have some nondescript procurators, and we're going back to procurators after he dies, Faddus and Alexander, and then in the time of Cumanus, there is a riot in the temple that takes place. Josephus mentions it's nowhere in the Bible, but it sort of sets the stage for some other things that take place in the New Testament. What happened is the Jews were celebrating one of their feasts, not sure which one it was, and one of the Roman soldiers up in the Fortress Antonia calls down, "Hey, you Jews!" And then he turns around and sort of flips up I guess he pulls down his pants and sort of does an obscene gesture with his backside. And a riot breaks out, and a number of people are killed at this time. It's after this that we have Antonius Felix. He had murdered the high priest. That's what he's known for, and also he's something of a bribe taker. But toward the end of the last couple of years of his oversight, we have that instance where the Apostle Paul goes into the temple, and it's rumored about that he's brought a Gentile into the temple. Now, he hadn't done that, but that's what the rumor was, and a riot breaks out, just like the riot that had taken place earlier. And Paul is arrested, and he's brought before Felix, and he's put on trial. And Felix says, "Well, he's not guilty, but I'm not going to release him. I'm hoping that the Christians will come up with a bribe." And he's known for one who always had an open hand to take bribes from whoever could pay the highest price. Felix is deposed in the year 60, and Festus becomes the procurator. And in that interim, between Felix and Festus, as Felix is going out and Festus is coming in, there's another hearing that Paul has before both of these men, and Paul shares the gospel with them and tells them about his seeing the risen Jesus. But after that, he's sent to Rome because he's appealed to Caesar, and he's sent to Rome. And so that whole latter part of the book of Acts with the ship voyage to Rome and the shipwreck and all those things, that takes place at that time, which helps us to cement exactly when these things take place. Just to finish up our list, we have Albinus. He, according to Josephus, puts James, the Lord's brother, the half-brother of Jesus, puts him to death. We had another James that had been put to death much earlier in Acts chapter 12. And finally, we have who's going to be the last Roman procurator, Florus. And under him, he's only been there for a couple of years when the Jews revolt. And they push the Romans out. A legion comes to quell the revolt, and they actually attack and destroy the Roman legion. And they think they've won their independence, and that war goes from 66 in 70 AD, Jerusalem is captured and destroyed. The revolt doesn't completely end there. Jerusalem is destroyed, and just a scattered remnant escape down to Masada, where they hold out another few years before that also falls, and the Jewish revolt has come to an end. Luke chapter 3 gives us some very specific chronological details. It starts off now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip was tetrarch of the region of Iturea, and it goes on from there. It speaks about the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. In other words, it sets forth all the major players. And that's also giving us the date when these events begin. You see, chronologically, Tiberius, we know that he became emperor on August of 14 AD, what we call that month. You add 15 years to that, and you have the ministry of John the Baptist, therefore, beginning at 29 AD. Now, some folks have said, well, wait a minute. Tiberius actually was ruling as co-regent for Octavius a couple years earlier, but you wouldn't normally think of that as the beginning of his reign. You would usually make that here in 14 AD. Now, how long was the ministry of Jesus? To answer that, we look at this chart on the ministry of Jesus, and it's in John's account in particular that we have the mention of 3 Passovers, and maybe a 4th. Notice in John chapter 2, verse 13, at the early ministry of Jesus, when he's doing a lot of ministry in Judea right at the outset, there's a Passover mentioned. Jesus goes to the temple, cleanses the temple. There's another Passover mentioned in John chapter 6, verse 4. That's when he's been in Galilee, and we compare that with the other gospel accounts, and that's actually fairly late in the Galilean ministry. So maybe considerable time has passed. There's a feast that's not mentioned in John chapter 5, verse 1, and some scholars think maybe that was a Passover as well. It just says the feast. Well, that sounds like it very well could be the Passover, just like when in the Bible it talks about the river, and that's the river Euphrates. The feast, that's often thought that's the Passover. And then, of course, there's a final Passover mentioned in John chapter 11, verse 55, as well as in the other synoptic Gospels, when that's the Passover where Jesus is crucified. So if that's correct, that means that we have about a 3-year ministry. Now, it could have been longer, but it could have been a lot longer, and the reason why I say that is because we have the events that are in the book of Acts, for which some of those we have very solid dates, and Jesus had to have been ministering and then death, burial, resurrection before any of those events take place. So I'm comfortable with supposing about a 3-year ministry, maybe a little bit longer, but not much, about a 3-year ministry of Jesus. Let's go to Nazareth. Remember that Jesus he's described as a carpenter, although when I look at the Greek word that describes him, the Greek word there is a tekton. You know how we have the word architect, and that tect part is the archi, that is the head builder. So actually the Greek describes him not necessarily as a carpenter, but as a builder. Of course, that could have included woodwork, but if you live in the land of Israel, then more often than not you're working not just with wood, but with stone. And so we can just call him a construction worker. The folks at the Nazareth village have reconstructed a synagogue and how it would have looked in that first century. A very small affair. You could have probably fit everybody in the village in this little tiny room. Now, nearby, about 4 miles to the northwest of Nazareth, was a town of Sepphoris. It had been destroyed by the Romans after a rebellion in 4 BC. When Herod the Great had died, there had been unrest, and the town had been destroyed then. And Herod Antipas had changed the name of the city to Autocrasis. Now, it's not going to keep that name long term. Eventually, it'll be called Sepphoris again. But we see a building program as the city was rebuilt in the days of Jesus. And continuing, it boasted a large theater. These are my pictures. I'm borrowing these. They have found remnants of a wealthy house that on the floor tiles had scenes of, very non-Jewish scenes, feasting and merriment and pagan gods and things like that. In other words, I had a city, even though it's in Jewish Galilee, I had houses here, at least one house, that had all sorts of Gentile accoutrements. Here's some work that they did on uncovering those mosaic tiles. Other artwork on the floor, very non-Jewish. Notice the injunction against graven images. They were not really paying that much attention to such injunctions. This is decidedly not a Jewish home. Here's an artist's reconstruction of one of the streets here on Sepphoris. If they were rebuilding the city, they would have needed builders like Joseph, like the young Jesus before he started his ministry. And it may well have been that Jesus came here and was involved in the rebuilding of the city. Could it even be the case that Jesus attended a play in the theater at Sepphoris? Well, next we want to move down to the Sea of Galilee. Again, I'm borrowing a photo from BiblePlaces.com. They've got an excellent group of photos. Also borrowing a few of my own photos here. The Sea of Galilee is around 500 feet below sea level. Now, Capernaum becomes his base of operations. The name Capernaum, Copper is a village, and Nahum, remember there's a prophet by the name of Nahum. So this is the village of Nahum. I'm not sure if he was really from here. Little tiny village. And it's located right on the edge of the Sea of Galilee. I probably ought to make mention of that Sea of Galilee. Luke never calls it a sea; he just refers to it as a lake. You can see across it. It's not like a giant sea. We would call it a lake today. But the Jews, they were landlubbers and desert-dwelling people, so they refer to it as the sea. Anything wet, that's the sea. You can go to Capernaum, and the village is made up of these connected houses. They call them insulas. But what we're looking at here is the synagogue at Capernaum. Now this is a 3rd century synagogue, but that 3rd century synagogue is built right on the foundations of a 1st century synagogue that had been there previously. Notice the difference in the color of the stones. The black stones, those are 1st century, the black basalt, and then the lighter stones, that's from a later synagogue, the later synagogue, the 3rd century synagogue. This little town, everybody would have known everyone. And, of course, everybody would, you didn't have multiple churches or multiple synagogues. It's a pretty good sized synagogue, which tells me that everybody from this, not only there, but the surrounding areas would come here to worship. It was a good base of operations for the ministry of Jesus. And we've already made mention of the foundation stone, so I'm going to pass over that. We also have the traditional House of Peter. This is a house which was built in the late Hellenistic period, and it was changed to what they call a domus ecclesia, that is a religious house, a house for religious gatherings. After the 1st century, it had a enclosure wall, and eventually, by about the 4th or 5th century AD, a church was built over top of it, an octagonal church, a church, with 8 sides. There's the aerial of the church. Now, if you go there today, they've put a sort of a museum-looking thing over top of the church so as to preserve it. There's a close-up of that octagonal church and what would have before that been Peter's house. They believe that the church was built over top of the house of Peter. Now let's go out onto the Sea of Galilee itself. You can see some of the surrounding areas leading up to sea level. The whole Sea of Galilee is below sea level. Just a few years back, a boat was discovered dating back to the 1st century. Now, I'm not saying that Jesus was ever in this boat or anything like that. I guess could have been, but chances are probably remote of that. But it just gives you sort of a feel for the boats that were used by the people living around the Sea of Galilee. Rather rickety affairs. Now, of course, this is 2,000 years old, so it was in much better shape. But even so, if you look at the crude, sort of rough construction, you can understand where a high wind would come up or a little bit of a storm, and people might be very afraid to be out on this boat in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. Now, Galilee was divided into Upper and Lower Galilee. That's not north and south. That Upper Galilee is actually higher. It's about 3,000 feet above sea level. Lower Galilee about 1,500 feet above sea level, and then Galilee itself about 500, 600 feet below sea level. We also have some other cities. We've already mentioned Nazareth and Sepphoris, Capernaum, but I'd like to take us up to Caesarea Philippi. And so we're going to move north through the Hula Valley, through the upper reaches of the Jordan River, and then we'll come to a place that's ancient name was Dan, or Laish. This is where the tribe of Dan, they didn't care for their inheritance back in the Old Testament times, so they resettled here up near the base of Mount Hermon, and right around the corner from a spur from the mountain that goes down into the valley. There's an ancient city called Caesarea Philippi. There was another Caesarea on the ocean. This was a separate Caesarea, also named after Caesar. And this mountain would come down, the spur of the mountain, this big cliff, this big, can I call it a rock, and some pagan temples. These were not temples to gods. These were temples to Greek gods. You can go there today, and the remnant, of course, the rock face is still there, and the cutout, the temple itself, only the foundation stones remain. But it was here that in this place of paganism that Jesus comes down with his disciples in Matthew chapter 16. And they probably had to wonder, what on earth are we doing in this place of paganism? And he brings them here and he says, who do men say that I am? And Peter says, well, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus gives a prophecy that I'm going to build my church and the gates of Hades will not prevail against us. Now he's saying this within earshot of the place of these pagan temples, which later rabbis, I don't know if this was already the case in Jesus' day, but later rabbis would refer to this place and the grottos behind the temple, because these caves were sort of the back door of the temple. They would refer to these grottos, these caves, as the gates of Hades. And Jesus says this and points out, look, that paganism that paganism will not be able to withstand the attack of the church. The church will come and break through and win over the gates of Hades. Now we want to move down the Jordan River. I think we've mentioned this already back when we were first looking at the land of Israel. There's an old photo, Compliments of National Geographic, showing that Jordan River Valley, as the Jordan gradually winds its way to the south. Here's a picture, modern day picture of the Jordan doing that very slow winding. And then it straightens out toward its end as it eventually flows into the Dead Sea. Like I said, this is a very old picture. Compliments of National Geographic back in the 1960s. The Dead Sea, the lowest spot on the face of the earth where you're still above sea level. Well, it's below sea level, but in other words, you're walking around on dry land, and today it's nearly 1,400 feet below sea level. It's actually been sinking. The Dead Sea has been gradually drying up during my lifetime. Now, if we go to the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, there's an escarpment and an ancient community known as Qumran, the Qumran community. It was here that the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in a number of caves. Now, the first cave they called that Cave 1, and then each time they'd find a cave with scrolls in it, they'd number it, Cave 2, 3. This happens to be Cave 4. Got some of those caves in the background. Standing in Qumran, they were all located up and down the cliff face around this Qumran community. Another shot of those caves. You can imagine the first of the scrolls being found by a young shepherd boy looking for a lost goat, and he throws a rock up into that cave, and instead hears a crash, and the rest is history. The community here would copy the scriptures, and we don't know if they regularly kept the scrolls in these caves, but at least when the Romans were invading at the fall of Israel in the War for Independence, 66 to 70 AD, as Romans were marching into this region, they took these scrolls and hid them in pots, in whatever sort of carrying case they could find within these caves to preserve them, and they certainly accomplished that. Now, if we move further south, we come to the fortress of Masada. The word Masada actually means fortress, so what I just said is the fortress of fortress. But Masada was a fortress that had been developed by Herod the Great, a wonderful palace system, and this became the place of the last stand of the Jews. We'll talk about this a bit later when we talk about the revolt of Jerusalem, the revolt of the Jews, and its destruction in 70 AD. Today, a visitor can use the cable car. I guess if you're really hardy, you can take the snake path up. My wife and I use the cable car to get up to the top. It was much easier. So glad that that's there. I'd like to talk about Herod Antipas. He's the son of Herod the Great. He is the ruler of Galilee and Perea. That's only part of the land. That's only part of the land of Israel. Here we are, Galilee in the north, Perea on the east side of the Jordan River, and as well as on the east side of part of the Dead Sea. At least that part is north of the Arnon River. Antipas is a tetrarch. That means that he's a ruler of the fourth part. He's the arch of a tet. The ruler of a fourth part. You know how you have a tetragrammaton, and that's 4 letters. Now, Antipas is going to take for his wife, somebody else's wife, Herodias. To understand how this plays out, we have to look at the family tree. We have Herod the Great, and Herod had a number of wives. I'm only looking at 3 of them right here. Mariamne, the last surviving of the Hasmonean line, that had been one of the Maccabees. He had married her, and her 2 sons, Alexander and Aristobulus. Herod had them both executed, had them put to death. Then there was also Archelaus, who ruled when Herod first died, beginning in 4 BC. But then there was a younger son, Antipas. That's who the one we're describing now. He was a bit younger, and eventually, it doesn't happen immediately, but eventually he's given rulership over Galilee and Perea. Now, Aristobulus, though he had died, he had several surviving children. He and his wife, it looks like Bernice, but we call it Bernike. And they had another Aristobulus. I guess we could call him Aristobulus Jr. But then Agrippa the First, and he's going to be very significant later on in the story in the book of Acts. He'll actually be king of a united Israel for a time. And then Agrippa the First has a sister, Herodias. And it's this Herodias who had originally married Philip, a son by still another marriage, and they had a daughter. Her name is not given in the Bible, but it is given in Josephus, who calls her Salome. Herodias had met her I guess you could call it her half-uncle, Antipas, when he came to visit, and he had sort of swept her off her feet, even though she's married. And she left her husband to go running away with Antipas, but she always wanted to be married to a king, and I guess Philip was, not moving in that direction. But Antipas, he's at least ruler of a fourth part, and she's urging him to eventually see what you can do to be king, which leads us to sort of to the rest of the story. You remember the Bible talks about how John the Baptist had spoken against their union, said they were committing adultery, and it was wrong. And so John the Baptist was arrested, and ultimately he was put to death. And the story about how that takes place is found in the Gospels, where the daughter of Herodias, I'm assuming that's Salome, although her name's not mentioned in the Bible, the daughter of Herodias dances for Antipas and then gets him to say, give me whatever you will. And it's not like he can give anything away, because he's the ruler of a fourth part, but he's not actually a king. He's under the authority of Rome. But he's trying to act as if he were a king, and so he says, yeah, I'll give you even to the half of my kingdom, and which it wasn't his to give. But he gives her the head of John the Baptist, and John the Baptist is put to death. Now, the later story after this is that Antipas has begun, contrary to Roman orders, developing a military organization and stockpiling weapons, and he wasn't supposed to be doing that. And his nephew Agrippa told on him, and he was called to appear before the emperor. Herodias went with him, and he was asked about this stockpile of weapons, and he had to confess and say, yes, I've really been doing that. And so he was removed from his tetrarchy, and he was banished, according to the sources, to Gaul, and Herodias went with him. And that's the last we hear of them. Now, let's close by talking about some of the religious sects that were present in first century Israel. First of all, there were the Pharisees. These were the separatists. The word phares is to separate. And so they were separating themselves from those nasty old Gentiles and from Jews who weren't necessarily towing the line when it came to the law. Over against them were the Sadducees. Now, we normally think of them as the liberal party. They, some Greek thinking perhaps had infiltrated. Although they would have denied that, they would have said, no, we are the purists. We hold only to the law, nothing but the law. Just the first 5 books of Moses, not those other books, so the oral law or the traditions. Just show us what's in the law. And the Sadducees, they were the ones who were tended to preside over the temple. In fact, if we want to compare the two, the Pharisees versus the Sadducees, Pharisees, the word means separated one. The Sadducees, the righteous ones. The Zadok is the root word there in Hebrew. The Pharisees held to the authority of the entire Old Testament as well as to the oral law. The Sadducees viewed the Torah as having the greater authority, and they largely dismissed the rest of the scriptures. They didn't take it as being authoritative. The Pharisees believed in things like miracles and angels and immortality. The Sadducees denied those things, even though angels are mentioned in the Torah. They rejected miracles and angels and immortality, as did the Greeks. The Pharisees believed in a future resurrection. The Sadducees denied any life after death. When you're dead, you're dead. That was the Sadducee way of thinking. The Pharisees they were popular among the people in the synagogue. That didn't mean there were a lot of Pharisees, but they were held in high esteem. By contrast, the Sadducees tended to rule politically in the temple. So we had the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but you also had 2 other parties we had to mention, the Essenes. These were communal separatists. They had decided even the Pharisees were too worldly for them, and we're not talking about physical worldliness. We're talking about how closely they observe the specific outward laws under the law. And they didn't care for, sometimes if you can't fit everybody in on one of the feast days, you span it over 2 days. And the Essenes said, no, you can't do that. In fact, their entire structure seems to be about all the things you cannot do. So they were separatists, and they had left those bad old Jews in Jerusalem. Now they don't even talk about Gentiles, but even they separated themselves even from other Jews. And finally, you have the Zealots. These were the nationalists who said all of our problems would be solved if we just get rid of Rome and just be our own kingdom. And so again, they're more of a political party. Now, the whole of first century Judaism really isn't in any of one of those four camps. You can look at Sadducees, Pharisees, Zealots, the Essenes. First century Judaism was somewhere in the middle. It was influenced by those poles, but those are the extreme poles, whereas Judaism was much more central.